Dr. Morten, thank you so much for joining us at the Arab Center Winter School. First, I'd like to ask, what's your impression of the Winter School so far?
I enjoyed it very much. It's really fascinating. It's great being here in Qatar at the Arab Center. It's fantastic being together with great scholars and also great students from, as far as I believe, 19 or 20 different countries.
19, yeah.
So having the chance to pick in their brain, and I have learned so much from the conversation with them. I always say also to my own students, I'm not only doing research-based teaching, I'm also doing a teaching-based research in the sense that I try to learn from my students, and I have learned a lot from the conversation we had during the days here. So it has been a great, great pleasure.
That's great. And we also aim to make it very interdisciplinary, so I think that's kind of been reflected in some of the conversations. So you have a project at our host university,
exactly.
SWAR. If you could tell us what the acronym stands for and what the project is about.
SWAR stands for Sectarianism in the Wake of the Arab Revolts.
Okay.
It began in 2015, funded by the Danish Social Science Research Council, and it is like the workshop, the Winter School here, interdisciplinary. We had a team of people from religious studies, anthropology and political science, based on the acknowledgement that sectarianism is a very complex phenomenon, which cannot be grasped only from one disciplinary lens. And for me it has also been really a very useful journey, cooperating, working closer together with people from other disciplines. And I think that exactly a phenomena as sectarianism should be, there you should try to triangulate insights from different kinds of disciplines.
Right. How have the recent uprisings in Lebanon and Iraq impacted the work that you guys do?
It has impacted the work in the sense that the SWAR project, if I first say a few words about the aims of the SWAR project, and then I will get to the more recent events. The SWAR project took its point of departure in an acknowledgement, on the one hand, that sectarianism is not a phenomenon which has only been dealt with after the Arab uprisings. It was also an issue before, but our point of departure was that much of the debate before the Arab uprisings, the academic debate, was about whether sectarianism really mattered. In the wake of the Arab uprising, there was a growing recognition that somehow sectarianism was a dimension in Arab politics. You should not reduce everything to sectarianism, but it was a dimension to be acknowledged. And the aim of the SWAR project was then first to examine what is sectarianism actually. It is a very, there's a lot of confusion as for what is sectarianism actually, what is so sectarian about sectarianism, so to speak. To what extent is it different from other forms of identity politics? How to grasp it.
And
yes, for instance, sectarianism, ethnic politics, is it just two words for the same?
For the same kind of cleavage,
yes,
right?
Exactly, or is it different? And we have used a lot of energy also to, we have also done what we have called comparative sectarianism, trying to compare the term sectarianism actually comes from a European Christian context. So to what extent is it useful to import ideas, theories, a concept from that context to the Middle Eastern context and to an Islamic context. And it appears quite quickly that there are huge differences.
Right.
And then we have also tried to compare, because there's also a tendency often to say that Shia Sunni sectarianism is about the Middle East. But actually it's also an issue at other places.
Right.
It has a longer history to some extent, for instance, in Pakistan. So we have also tried to examine to what extent the form of sectarianism we've seen in the Middle East is similar or different from what we have seen elsewhere. So that was one of the ambitions of the SWAR project. The other ambition of the SWAR project was to map and reflect on how do we actually observe sectarianism. Because there's also,
so like the data collection process?
Yeah, and also the reflection of should we look at pure demographics? Should we look at rhetoric? Should we look at attitude? Should we look at behavior? Should you look at institutions?
So where is sectarianism happening?
And how do we observe it?
Right.
How do we know? And each of these strategies contains a danger of seeing too much or too little. So what we tried to do in the project was to triangulate and use different kinds of methods in order to map sectarianism, also based on an acknowledgement that on one hand it might be that sectarianism had become a factor in Arab politics in the recent decade, but it was also certainly clear that the importance of sectarianism varied across the region, and therefore also we developed a typology of different kinds of sectarianism. So it was not the same sort type of sectarianism we saw in different
It's
parts.
not like a blanket statement.
Yes, exactly.
That's
what you're
great.
seeing in a Lebanese context and in some Gulf context
It's very different.
is very different.
Right.
You might use the same word, but the dynamics are very different.
Yeah. I've noticed this a lot when it's like in Lebanon versus Saudi Arabia.
Yeah.
The sectarianism is not the same.
It's completely.
Yeah.
And then the third goal of the project was to explain why. And there's been a tendency in part of the academic debate sometimes to argue, to claim that there are two positions: the primordialist position, which would go all the way back to the battle at Karbala and so on and so forth, and then an instrumentalist position which would say it is just about politics.
Right.
And there we tried then to actually to examine whether that these two extremes happens not actually to be quite representative of the actual academic debate, because most scholars nowadays
kind of in the middle.
are neither pure primordialist or pure instrumentalist. So the real debate actually happens to be what does the kind of, how could you imagine a third way? And there are multiple ways of imagining third ways as for how to explain sectarianism. And then the fourth dimension then in the project was to reverse the question. Instead of explaining sectarianism, then we asked, what is the consequences, implications of a growing sectarianism? Where we, for instance, examined governance, forms of the dynamics related to democratization, to forms of authoritarianism, and so on and so forth. Authoritarianism, is it different in a sectarian context compared to a non-sectarian context? What is the impact on international politics and conflict, alliance making? To what extent will that change in a sectarianized context? And we also examined the Islamist scene, because it happens to be so that there's actually been quite little attention to the role of whether Shia and Sunni Islamism differ from each other. So here we examined to what extent are different dimensions of Middle East politics or Arab politics impacted by sectarianization. And that brings me then to your original question.
About the protests, yeah.
Yes, exactly. Because the last decade there has been a lot of debate about sectarianization, sectarian search, and so on and so forth. And what we saw in Lebanon and in Iraq in the fall of 2019 was clearly anti-sectarian protest. And that was really, really interesting. And that is also part of what we're doing right now, actually, also to examine how to grasp that. And there, it also turns out that just as sectarianism is a very complex phenomenon, it also turns out that this anti-sectarian move
this pushback
is very, very complex, partly because if you want to counter sectarianism, you also have to reflect upon what you actually mean by sectarianism. Is sectarianism only associated with violence? Or is it also to be sectarian just to identify yourself as a Shia and Sunni and observe festival rituals or the like? So if you are anti-sectarian, is it then, do you try to get rid of even people's right to have different faiths?
An identity,
yes,
right.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Or is it more
about how government is allocated?
Yes, yes, exactly.
No, I'm getting
and it appears that there's a huge confusion as for what is actually going to be countered. And in addition to that, there's also very different views as for what to replace a kind of sectarian order with. Some would argue that what should be done is that we should get rid of sectarianism per se, and in favor of some kind of homogenizing vision. We are all equal, we are all alike. And in both Lebanon and Iraq, you also hear these voices in different forms. Some would argue that actually Shia and Sunni, they are united on more issues than that divide them. So actually,
Or it's like a class thing,
yeah.
or yeah.
Some would say it's
Yeah.
a class thing or a nationalist thing, that we all belong to the same nation or the same humanity and so on and so forth. And on the one hand, there are a lot of positives to say about this kind of unity measures, but of course the potential pitfall here would be who have the right, the power to define what unites us.
Yeah, at the end of the day, the majoritarian kind of...
Yes, exactly.
input,
And
yeah.
will there be place for minorities? And then there's another kind of strategy which tries to replace the Shia Sunni divide with other kinds of divides. For instance, it is the elite against the people.
Similar to what Dr. Azmi was saying.
Yeah. So it is other kind of divides that are emphasized. And again, and for instance, also it's quite interesting to observe. You also have, for instance, you also have a discourse here trying to make a divide between the radicals and the mainstream. And then you combine both various Sunni and Shia strands in the mainstream, and then single out some
fringe groups
as the radicals.
Right.
And then suddenly most Shias become part of the majority. But again, there's the danger as for who have the power, the right to define the new dividing lines. And then you have the third kind of strategy, which is saying that actually we acknowledge the existence of different sects, that the people identify that sex-centric identity, so to speak, matters. So what is important is not to get rid of them, but to promote coexistence, cooperation.
Right.
And that you could say is not anti-sectarian but multi-sectarian. So the aim would more to be to accept diversity, but enhance or enable coexistence. So there are these. So these three strands all agree that all the problematic dimensions of sectarianism should be countered, but it appears they have very different visions as for how and what is a kind of post-sectarian, what should a post-sectarian society look like.
Right.
And these strands, I would say, can also be observed in the current debate, for instance, in Lebanon and in Iraq, but I also think, for instance, in the Gulf, you also see this trends trying to get beyond sectarianism in various countries. And there you also see this tensions between different kinds of strands.
Yeah, I imagine it's a very fertile ground for what you guys are working on. And hopefully the Winter School is going to give you kind of an opportunity to engage with some of the Arab literature on the subject.
It has been extremely inspiring. It has been extremely useful to have this group of people from so different places and so from so different disciplines to have a dialogue on these issues. So I have enjoyed it very much, and I'm looking forward to the coming days as well.
Thank you so much for being here and for explaining so thoroughly the project you're working on, and hopefully it'll be a productive couple of days.
It has been a great pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you.